This Word in Your Ear is brought to you thanks to NordVPN. VPN, of course, stands for Virtual Private Network, which is a way to keep your data safe on the internet whenever you're logging in, either at home or abroad. VPN protects your identity and encrypts your data so that nobody can steal that identity. And at the same time, it enables you to access the internet via servers in more than 50 different countries. That means you can often sidestep region restrictions and stream movies and TV programs from all around the world. Of course, the great truth about streaming, which is the film you want to see, is always streaming in another country. In my recent travels on NordVPN just now, I've been watching Carry On Sergeant with William Hartnell, The Colditz Story with John Mills, and a recent Australian contribution to the comedy of embarrassment called Fisk. So if you want to take advantage of a deal where you can try NordVPN by going to nordvpn.com/yourear, or just use the code YourEar to get a huge discount off your NordVPN plan and one additional month for free and a bonus gift. It's risk-free because there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. Full details in the show notes.
You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
Mark, good news. I've got a Stack Waddy game.
Delightful.
Which occurred to me only this week. I don't know why, but I was looking at the listings for a small venue in Home Firth in Yorkshire, which is not far from where I come from. And Home Firth, you probably know, is the home of Last of the Summer Wine. It's the home of, Compo and Cleggy that we frequently reference. Anyway, one of the things that this venue does is it hosts tribute acts on a regular basis.
Lovely.
And I picked up 5 names of tribute acts here, one of which I invented. Okay,
go on.
And your challenge, should you choose to accept it, is to identify the one that I made up, hence the Stack Waddy game. Okay, here we go with 5 tribute acts. Clearwater Creedence Revival. The Dutiful South. Okay. The Clone Roses. A band called Malice. That's a band called Malice. And the Antarctic Monkeys. Your job, Mark Allen, is to tell me which of those 5 is a product of my imagination, and the other 4 are actual tribute acts plying their trade in Yorkshire.
Well, I love the old tribute act thing. The Half Moon in Putney seems to run nothing but tribute acts now, doesn't it? Think Floyd, Fleetwood Mac. I'm fairly sure the Clone Roses exist. I'm sure I've seen them advertised before. And a band called Malice, I think, too. I may be wrong. Don't stop me. Clearwater Creedence Revival is weak, I think. And I don't think you would have invented that. The Antarctic Monkeys, ditto. It's just uninspired. So I think the one you've made up, because it's very entertaining, and references the whole concept of the name itself, is the Dutiful South. But am I wrong?
Damn you, you're right.
Oh, no, right. Okay.
You're absolutely correct.
Oh.
The Clone Roses, I see, are currently on their 25th anniversary tour, which must mean that they've been going nearly as long as the act they're intended to pay tribute to. So, okay, well, I do my best to provide a bit of amusement.
Well, you tried.
Yeah,
on this rare occasion, you failed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm kind of glowing with a pathetic sense of pride.
Yes, quite. So this week has been, it's been Russell Brand week, hasn't it?
God, it has, yes. Yeah, well, that's a story, isn't it? My goodness me.
I don't really know anything about Russell Brand. I think I can claim a blameless record in never finding him funny. Because I never entirely understand how the word comedian came to be.
Well, I don't remember. I can remember when we were at Word, we were, in no way really obliged to write about him because he wasn't really our kind of demographic. The whole point of Russell Brand was kind of the youth folk, wasn't it? Hence so many newspapers and radio stations were desperate to employ him. But I can remember that his PR ringing up and saying, you must cover this guy. He's going to be huge. And how right they were. And we went, to the Brits. Wasn't he presenting the Brits one year?
I think he
was. And I can remember coming away from that and thinking, I don't understand what he is because he was billed as a comedian, but he wasn't really a comedian. He was just a sort of, I don't know, just a voice, wasn't he? Just a mouth on legs. He was a kind of philosopher, wasn't he? He was a kind of he talked about politics. He talked about major solutions to world problems. He talked about the world being a gigantic conspiracy and all the kind of things that the student audience would probably relate to. But I don't remember I never remember being remotely funny, actually, feeling slightly chilling, actually.
Yes, chilling is definitely the case.
Creepy.
I'll tell you what's interesting to me about this story this week. It just from a kind of show business point of view, if you want to put it that way, is just how swiftly, absolutely everybody has just dropped him. This time last week, when did the story break?
It was. Yeah.
Okay. So just over a week ago, all these people, publisher, his PR, his agents, his TV deals, everybody, his sponsors, were all perfectly happily.
Yeah, and even the advertisers on the one platform that still promotes him pulled out this morning, I think. But we're recording it.
But let me just, just 10 days ago, all these people were all getting on with their business with him, putting in their invoices and getting their money and so forth, all perfectly happily. And then this story breaks, and absolutely has won. They all drop it.
Yeah,
and that suggests to me a number of things. They must have had their own suspicions, but were quite prepared to just swallow those suspicions as long as they could put the invoice in and
how could you not have had your suspicions if he used to talk about this kind of thing, kind of boast about it, didn't he? I mean, not the kind of murkier end of it, but just about his promiscuity all the time. Do you remember that time when he was at the absolute peak of his game and every time he appeared, and there were paparazzi camped outside his palatial North London house, and he was always come out with one, possibly more than one, very, very attractive, very young-looking girl, and just parading these women, in a thoroughly repulsive way, and he made no secret of the fact that was going on. So how could they not suspect?
Well, I don't know. I mean, because obviously these people are a lot closer dealings with him than reading about him in the newspaper, and they're dealing with them all the time. But the swiftness with which they dropped him suggested that, we always knew. But, as long as it wasn't public, we were all right with that. And also, then the reason they've all dropped him is not moral disapproval. I mean, they all issue their pious statements about this. But what really bothers them is that they're going to suffer brand contamination through their association with him. Because, leaving aside Russell Brand, is just such an interesting reflection on how things work nowadays. You know what I mean? It's that nobody... You'll always have controversy in show business. You've always had it. You always will. But what you know now, what is the case now that never was the case 20, 30 years ago, is that if it looks as if it's going to go wrong, they will all run away. Absolutely every last one of them will run away. Nobody will hang about and say, well, I always found him a really nice bloke.
No, I totally agree with that. But part of that is that I think that if the longer you delay your running away, the more it implies that you're prepared to not accept, but you're not advertising your disapproval soon enough and loudly enough. So there's an element of that, I think.
I suppose so, but it's just it's just the way the world works, isn't it? Now, that suddenly one day it just swings completely away from them, and
I know the newspaper coverage. I've forgotten that he wrote for 8 years, wrote a Guardian sports column. So he guest edited the New Statesman. And then, it was extraordinary. He was invited to do so by the associate editor, Jemima Goldsmith, and then moved in with her for a year. Didn't he? I mean, it's just.
Well, so you reminded me. It's quite staggering. I was reading a thing in the Sunday Times this morning. Hadley Freeman wrote a piece about it, and then when she used to work at the Guardian, she said, "I used to sit in conferences with this guy and think, well, he's a bit out there, but he's on our side."
Yeah.
She said she pointed out that Stylist magazine once ran a cover which said, "If only more men were like Russell Brand."
No.
Yes. Oh, there must be some people seeking to get, to destroy all the evidence of that now. It's absolutely astonishing because I can't think of, there have been showbiz cancellations before, but I can't think of one that's as widespread.
There's widespread and as rapid, you're right. And as
comprehensive. And the reason it's widespread, is going back to the point you made earlier, is that all media, particularly in the last 20 years, and this particularly applies to television and radio, is suffering from the creeping terror that young people can live without them. Young people don't watch the television, literally do not watch
They do not buy newspapers.
They certainly don't buy newspapers.
They don't listen to a lot of mainstream radio.
They don't, Mark, they literally
Often
do not
not.
listen to radio.
Yeah.
Literally don't do it at all. And so when a chap comes along like him and they say, "Oh, well, the young people like him is because he's edgy, but he can talk about politics or culture or whatever. Let's get him on. Let's bring him into our tent because there's a chance that few of these young people will follow him."
But Ed Miliband, do you remember that? Ed Miliband very closely embraced him.
They've all done it,
And radio too, that again, when Leslie Douglas was there, just a massive kind of recruitment of alt comedians, wasn't it? You remember all that? Steve Merchant and Adam and Joe, Russell Brand, anybody that might possibly get somebody in to listen to radio too who was kind of under 20 or whatever. And
also, what's really interesting about all this is that there is no indication, as far as I can see, that any of it worked in terms of winning over young people. In terms of having 19-year-olds listening to Radio 2 or even Six Music, there is no indication that it works whatsoever. But it's just one of those things that media does because it makes itself feel more relevant, because it can't bear the idea that it might be drifting into irrelevance,
And he's redirected the whole debate, not about what he might or might not have done, but towards the whole idea that it's a giant conspiracy. Close down free speech.
I'm really pissed off about this, frankly, because I spent years working in mainstream media and spent years going to meetings and board meetings and all kinds of things. And I'm really hacked off that not once did I get invited to a conspiracy meeting. I'm bloody furious. And, Charlie Hickson was commiserating with me on Twitter about this. He was the same. We decided to check our spam boxes. And there are all the invitations. Can you please make a meeting for a conspiracy on the 3rd of July, 2008? No, it's just there. It's there in your spam box if you're looking for it. Because even I see Rupert Murdoch, who retired this week at the age of 92, is it?
93, I think he is.
93. Yeah. He was complaining about the elites. I mean, come on, for God's sake. You're Rupert Murdoch. Who's more elite than you? For God's sake. Anyway, so, I missed all those meetings.
The Word Podcast. Prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
Dave, it's the 30th anniversary of Mojo, which we were both involved with the launch of. Anniversary issue out just now. And I got the old first issue out and had a look at it, which I noticed there are copies of selling for £44.99 on eBay. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean to sound in any way self-congratulatory here, but it was good stuff. It really was. I thought it was more influential than Q. Q was a very good magazine as regards, the reviewing the massive stuff that was out at the time. But this was it really helped establish that deep end rock culture. I think the world of vinyl completists. It was songwriters rather than bands. Q tended to be the cover stories of U2 and Terence Trent D'Arby and Eurythmics and George Michael. This was Tom Waits and Joni Mitchell and Frank Zappa in the band. And I was struck by the fact that I remember we were looking for a cover story that would somehow advertise the difference between this and Q. And John Baldy, the late John Baldy, who worked at Q magazine, who edited The Telegraph, which is a specialist Dylan fanzine, had a bootleg, didn't he, of the Pennebaker movie made about Dylan's 1966 tour called Eat the Document. And this is so niche because this is a film that never came out. And he had a bootleg of it. But most bootlegs of it had there was one scene deleted, which was the scene where Dylan meets John Lennon around the time that he's playing the Albert Hall. And our cover story was about the deleted scene from a bootleg movie. Mm-hmm. Now, that for an unavailable movie, how niche can you get? That was pretty fantastic.
I suppose it's really interesting to reflect on the things that have changed in that 30 years. Because you're quite right. That was the kind of material that in those days, so when we were talking about 1993, so it's not what else is happening in 1993. It's Nirvana, isn't it, and all that? It is, isn't
it? Just before, it was. It was.
It is.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And CDs are selling.
This was grunge. Yeah.
It was grunge. CDs are selling in enormous quantities. For very high prices. And the internet must be just starting to kind of raise its head, and nothing more than that. And so, if you wanted to base something on a deleted scene from an obscure Bob Dylan film that hadn't come out, you needed to know somebody like John Baldy.
Yeah.
And there weren't many people like John Baldy.
No. Wasn't something you could find online. Exactly.
That's my point.
He had a VHS tape and said, watch this.
Whereas now, if you want to find anything, it's out there. It's out there on the internet. And if you wanted to know about it, you needed to know somebody like John Baldy. And there weren't many people like John Baldy. There were about half a dozen of them worldwide, probably, who had that level of knowledge of an interest in Bob Dylan, even Bob Dylan. Whereas now, 30 years later, there are innumerable people who know that kind of thing. And there are innumerable sources for which you can access the kind of material that they were talking about. And that's the thing that I don't think any of us envisaged when the magazine was launched, because, the idea was, and forgive me for lapsing into the kind of old, vanished world of publishing, but the idea was, that you had Q that was kind of younger, it was 20s and early 30s. And that you could do a magazine that was for slightly older people, that might start at 35 or whatever up. And what none of us predicted was that there would be a market for that kind of enthusiast, for kind of connoisseur classic rock, if you like, that would be younger and older as well. You know what I mean? You get a new generation coming along who hadn't necessarily grown up with Neil Young and Bob Dylan or whoever were you.
But wish they had.
But kind of wish they had.
Oh, absolutely. No, that was extraordinary, which they weren't getting from Q Magazine.
No, not at all.
And I think a lot of that was to do with the fact that we were employing people to write about it who were there at the time, really. That cover story was written by Richard Williams. You know, Richard Williams was, whatever he was, 15 when Dylan kind of first appeared. John Peel wrote a piece about Elvis Presley. I mean, again, first-hand experience of what it was like growing up. And now you got that thing where that sort of cliche of kind of, it was a sunny afternoon in Laurel Canyon when when Graham Nash in his trademark frayed suede jacket turned to David Crosby and said, "I've got a great idea for a song." Yeah. And you think, well, mate, you're 25. Were you there? Did you see this happen?
No,
so we thought there was real value in actually just finding people who are first-hand observers of what was going on.
But it's moved on, far beyond that. So it's kind of become, I suppose it's the nearest analogy is, the trad jazz movement of the late 50s and early 60s, we talked in the past about Ken Collier, haven't we? The great pioneer of British trad jazz and skiffle, going off to New Orleans to try and, meet some of the last of the original creators of Dixieland music, finding that were mainly dying.
Yeah.
And there was no interest in that music, it had kind of gone away. And then it was revived by the enthusiasm of a bunch of younger people who kind of wished that they had been there. So George Melly and his generation kind of did the same thing, didn't they?
Yeah.
As has been subsequently done with, as you say, Laurel Canyon Rock and Bob Dylan and all this kind of thing.
It really is.
And I don't think anybody would have predicted that. I certainly wouldn't have predicted that it was there.
And nor would I have predicted the kind of publishing boom, that kind of niche rock and roll publishing boom, because I was looking at that first issue and there's lovely ideas in there, one called Archaeology, which is just old press cuttings. I think it was about U2. The cover story itself was about 10 days in the life of the Beatles and Bob Dylan in whatever it would be, May 66, I think. And now that's become a kind of publishing thing. You can get whole books on just the Beatles Magical Mystery Tour. In fact, I think there's a book on just the Beatles going to Newquay during the shooting of the Magical Mystery Tour. I mean, it's so specific.
But am I not correct in recalling, Mark, and hear me out here, that the reason we stopped doing archaeology after the first few issues was that IPC, who were the owners of the Enemy and Melody Maker,
started charging us?
No, they wanted to stop us altogether because it was reprinting.
Oh, because we were publishing as all Enemy and Melody Maker, wasn't that? That's right.
Well, it would be. And the irony of this is they were making noises at the time about making all this stuff available anyway. And a few years later, I spoke to somebody who did this. Loads of old Enemy and Melody Makers were scanned.
That's right, and put up as an archive. Yeah.
No, they were going to be available commercially available, so that you would be able to just online. You would be able to take any old issue of the Enemy from September 1967 and pretty much read it on screen. And they did all the work to make that possible, but couldn't find a way to clear the rights at all, and so didn't do it, which is a crying bloody shame.
Really. Yeah, it really is.
Because that would be a fantastic resource to have. But I think that's the reason that archaeology was quietly dropped after a few issues. But yes, so 30 years ago, which is extraordinary. And so
just reading Paul's introduction, it's so sweet. He says his little intro at the front, Paul Du Noyer, the editor, and he says, where are we? He says, yes, welcome to this first edition. He said, it's our confirmed intention to pitch a wang-dang-doodle all night long, if necessary.
Yes, he did.
That's our plan. So wipe your feet, loosen your collar. You found a new place to dwell. That was really good because it did seem like a place. Funny, Q just seemed like a big brassy kind of entertainment. It was like watching a big movie or something. But Mojo really was a little kind of club that you went to, full of like-minded souls, who really understood all those arcane references. The most Mojo thing about it is the pull quote from the Bob Dylan Beatles piece written by Richard Williams. And he says, if the Beatles were a Peter Blake version of a Buckingham Palace garden party, Bob Dylan was a black and white Danny Lyon photo of a Mississippi Civil Rights March. Now, if you could get all those kind of reference points, you were in. It was just a totally new world, I think.
Yeah.
And I remember the third issue was a major break. The fourth issue was the one that sold with Frank Zappa on the cover. And I think we all then knew that was going to. Frank Zappa just died with this huge memorial, But I think the third issue, it was the one that had the band's second album in it. And that totally epitomized everything about Mojo for me. I remember Andy Cowles not finding the right kind of typefaces to produce this kind of woody and organic layout that he wanted. So going out and buying lino and doing lino cuts and hand printing it on the pages.
That's
you used to describe the book as handcrafted, but it really was handcrafted. Absolutely incredible. And I think that's the interesting thing too, the band, all their values, this sort of democracy, this kind of sense of roots music, the sense of kind of Americana. I think that all began to really take off around then. And I think Mojo played a part in that. It was a fantastic magazine.
But it's also, like you say, the Frank Zappa issue. Nothing sells like death.
No.
Absolutely.
And we realised from that point, that actually even people who are only... Because the point is when a musician dies, then
everybody
likes them. Because all you remember is your warmest thoughts. You remember the time in your life when they connected with you. And everything else is forgiven, actually. It's extraordinary.
But also, if you haven't liked them, you sort of think that you ought to.
Yes, you should.
So
You've got to catch up.
Suddenly get interested in things that they weren't interested in before.
Yeah.
So talking to the strange psychology of people's attachment to popular music, Joel Diath, who runs Brighter Day Vinyl, who we've had on this channel in the past, he posted a thing the other day that he'd bought a whole collection of records. This is what he does a lot of the times, chase around the country, looking at, collections of records, maybe from people who may have died or may have decided to downsize or whatever, and deciding whether to buy them, whether they're the kind of thing he thinks he can shift. And this week you got a whole collection of records which were still sealed and in their bags.
It's amazing, isn't it? So
absolutely.
Because I was thinking there's two reasons for that. Either that somebody, well, three, I suppose, that might never have played them, which is unlikely, but there could have been the kind of people who buy two copies, one to keep and then sell pristine and one to play. Or they could be, and this is a whole new emerging market, isn't it? People who buy records but actually don't play them. Quite often because they don't have any equipment to play them on.
There was a recent survey in the United States by a magazine, I think it says, and they said that they came to the conclusion that 50% of the people who bought vinyl had no record player to play that vinyl on. And I was telling you this week.
So that's like it's like buying antiques, isn't it? You just, what do? You just scatter them around your living room. Is that what you do? Do you sit and study the sleeve while streaming the track?
I do not know, but this I do know, Mark. As somebody I know, her daughter just started university a couple of weeks ago, and was telling her mother that she'd met some bloke who were in the bar on the first night or whatever, and he'd invited her back to see his Discogs.
Irresistible.
I thought,
oh, you silver-tongued devil. my God. Meaning
gonna...
what? Meaning the vinyls that he bought through Disco. Presumably that's an old copy of Astral Weeks or something, which he can't then play to her.
That was my question, was what do you do? You kind of look at the computer screen where you see all the stuff that he's bought from Discogs. No, he had gone to university with all his records, but obviously didn't have anything to play them on. And I thought that was a really quite a touching thing. And I thought, if I was 18 in 2023, that's probably what I would do. Because if you're, now, forgive me if I go way off my expertise here, but, if you're an averagely insecure 18-year-old bloke, going to university, very nervous about all kinds of things. How are you going to fit in, How are you going to find some friends? Well, wouldn't it be nice to meet a girl? All that kind of thing. You're going to think, how can I possibly make an impression in this world? Oh, I know. I've got 35 vinyls, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which I've accumulated through various record store days or whatever. It would be pathetic if I was away at Keele University or Liverpool or wherever it is, and I was having to try and tell this girl about these records. No, I'm going to take these records with me, even though I've got nothing to play them with, because they are me. That's really what they're all about, isn't it? You know what I mean? The ownership of these things, they are me. That's what I add up to, I thought they were very touching.
It's about announcing your personality. It's like a very large version of a lapel badge, isn't it?
Yes. And you don't have to listen
or a T-shirt or a pop T-shirt.
You've got to look at them.
Yeah.
So and the Joel story about the because he published pictures of this stuff on on Twitter or whatever, and it's all in its shrink wrap. And I said, "Is it all from one retailer?" He said, "No, it's all from a few different retailers. Still got the price stickers in the top right of these things, So and these are not necessarily very new records. They might be 10 years, 20 years old. Whoever's bought them, I do not know. You may be right. You may be right in saying it was somebody who had one copy to play and another one to keep. But it reminded me of a story. I don't know if I've ever told you this before. So I used to work at the big HMV shop in Oxford Street back in the 70s, and there was it was self-service, that place. So records were shrink wrapped. They were in the racks, and so they had security men, because people could pinch them. Records slightly more difficult to pinch. The things they used to pinch was cassettes, because cassettes you could drop them in your pocket, whatever. But I think this was probably in the very early days of security cameras, or no security cameras at all. And security was administered by a bunch of blokes in their 50s and 60s, I would imagine that. I'd imagine they've all shuffled off their mortal coil.
Yeah.
So I can say this, what I'm about to say. And amongst security men, I'm sure many of them were fine, upstanding citizens. But you get the odd bad apple, definitely. I don't think it's not unknown. It's like bent copies or whatever.
Yeah.
And after I left, this happened in the early 80s, and I was told this by a friend of mine who was still working there. All these guys used to share one major enthusiasm. They were obsessed with James Last.
Oh, my goodness.
Absolutely loved James Last. There wasn't a single one of them who didn't love James Last. Or Hansy, as he was known to his fans. In fact, to the extent that when James Last used to come over and play the Albert Hall, which he did.
Why was he called Hansy? Was his German name?
That's his real name. It's was his real name, Hans.
Yeah.
He was known as Hansy to his fans. And when he used to play the Albert Hall, they used to all get dressed up in costumes. So these guys who all looked like grizzled actor types that you might see in the background of Ealing comedies. They all look like Arthur Mullard, if you remember. They would get dressed up in sombreros, cowboy outfits, and, just mad over the top fancy dress. Anyway, they're obsessed with James Last. And James Last used to put out a record most weeks, non-stop dancing volume 63.
Last through the party, yeah.
And anyway, they got a new head of security who decided that the company was losing rather too much on shrinkage, as they used to call it. And
shrinkage, is that theft?
Shrinkage would, what you lost one way or another. And so one of these guys was followed home one evening to his place in Edmonton or Tottenham or whatever. And they went in there, and there was a house entirely occupied by James Last records. Just thousands of them in every conceivable space.
Like a scene from Alan Partridge. That's right.
And they weren't just individual copies. There were, multiple copies of Non-Stop Dancing number 63, 20 copies or whatever. And there was a part of me, when my mate Steve told me about this, I remember the two of us just sitting in a pub thinking, yeah, I can understand that. Yeah. Because
if that was Hapsash and the coloured coat, you would have done the same thing yourself.
That's my
Pete
point.
Brown's battered ornaments, fine.
That's my point. If you now stealing is wrong. Let's be clear about that. But if you could, without fear of the long arm of the law interceding, if you could steal multiple copies of one record, what would it be? What would you most like to have? An entire record? Would it be Frank Zappa's Hot Rats or Joni Mitchell's Court and Spark or, the band's? Imagine that. You've got a room just full of the band's second album. Wouldn't you like that, Mark?
Perfect wallpaper. It'd be absolutely brilliant. 5 guys in light drizzle. That's right. But what a picture.
Yeah. So every night you could come home, Mark, and you could pull out from a rack full of the band's second album. You could pull out another copy. You could slit the shrink wrap every time, take it off.
Play a pristine new copy. Yes.
Wouldn't you like to do that?
I would, for weeks on end. It'd be worth the lengthy jail sentence. That's wonderful.
This is a junction in the Word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
I saw your tweet the other day about bands whose T-shirts you'd wear even if you didn't own any of their records, which is, of course, in fact, owning records in itself is a slightly kind of old-fashioned notion. But I totally got that. And there were various ones that I would go for, I think. The Edgar Broughton Band. These are bands I just broadly approve of. I like the idea of I don't have any of their records. Edgar Broughton Band, Steppenwolf, La Belle, the Marvelettes, the Herman's Hermits, the Stone Ponies, the Trogs. I think there's certain bands with just really good names. Hapsash and the Coloured Coat, Strawberry Alarm Clock, Chocolate Watch Band, Trees, Question Mark, the Mysterians. I would gladly wear any of those T-shirts. So any that you might be persuaded to?
Well, it's funny. On? I've just found the original thing that triggered this thing. Somebody published a picture of a blackboard in a record shop, I think, and it just says "Rant of the Day." If your T-shirt advertises a band but you don't have any of their albums, you're an arse. And Radio X had said that's harsh but fair. And I thought it's just completely ridiculous point of view, really, because if you look at all the biggest T-shirt sellers, they've sold far more T-shirts than their records.
Yeah.
And the classic case of this are the Ramones. You know, that even when they were going, they sold more T-shirts than they sold records. And because people just liked the idea of associating themselves with the Ramones. And I always think it's really interesting that the successful T-shirts always seem to advertise a kind of indiness. I always find it interesting. When you go through airports, try this, Mark. When you go through airports, you will inevitably see, if you're in Heathrow Airport or Kennedy Airport or whatever, and I've seen this on more than one occasion, you will see kind of middle-aged, prosperous-looking, leathery-skinned individuals who've just come back from topping up their tan in Dubai or whatever, and are on their way back to Florida or Virginia Water or God knows what. Yeah. And they are lolloping through the terminal, looking as if they got far more important things to be doing. And really what they're doing is on their way to the business class lounge or whatever, or they're going to buy some duty free.
They're going to buy a £700 bottle of single malt whiskey.
Yeah, and they probably got sunglasses perched on the top of their heads. Yeah, one of them, I guarantee you, will be wearing a Nirvana T-shirt.
Yes,
I've seen this hundreds of times. And what this is the wearing of this T-shirt says, do you know, I used to be a hell of a person back in the day.
Yeah, and still am. It threw me like a stick of rock. I may now be in corporate finance, but I'm still
Absolutely.
I'm still a smells like Teen Spirit guy deep down. I know.
It's absolutely extraordinary.
And also it advertises the idea that it's downtime. And I'm now kind of I'm not at work. I'm my old self,
Whereas nobody is going around wearing those kind of T-shirts about, I don't know, the Bee Gees or Simply Red or or Kylie Minogue. It's always that kind of, hey, I'm edgy. I'm edgy. Underneath it all, I'm really edgy. And so edginess, for the Ramones and Nirvana it was a quality that they sold. They did every bit as well out of edginess as they did out of Beat on the Brat or Smells Like Teen Spirit, And of course, and that's the stuff that's now, it's all owned by companies whose job it is to keep on selling that stuff forevermore, And so it's long past the point of having anything to do with whether you got 3 of their records or 10 of their records or none of their records. It just doesn't matter at all. So, I got a list of the ones I wish I could find. I wish I could find a Geno Washington and the Ram Jam.
That's a great idea. Yes.
I'd like an Idle Race T-shirt.
That's good.
I'd like one for Cat Mother and the All Night Newsboys. I'd like one for the Impressions. I'd like one for the Hampton Grease Band. And the one I'd like most of all is Lambert, Hendricks and Ross. I haven't got any other records at all. I just like the idea.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
Now we're joined by our birthday Patreon guest, Steve Way. Steve, nice to see you.
And you?
When was the birthday?
Oh, a couple of weeks ago now.
Oh, right. Okay. We're
How
always
was it
on
celebrated?
I can't remember. It can't be that memorable, can it? I know. I was. I spent the weekend in a showman's caravan in Sussex.
Right. Very good. Very, very, very long Ronnie Lane Slim chance there.
It was a bit travelling show, yes.
Very good. Very good. Nothing wrong with that.
How is a shaman's caravan different from any other caravan?
Showman, not a shaman.
Oh, sure, he said a shaman. Sorry, I was going to say.
Well, I suspect the E's are better in that.
He's deaf, you know.
Very good. That's great.
Oh, dear.
So what's your log? Oh, well, you was the musical directors thing, wasn't it? That's right, yes. Yeah. Who were your great influences that made you...
I think it's very interesting. You start as a 16-year-old, and certainly when you were 16 in the early 80s, in tribal mode. And tribal mode was, this music's good, that music's bad. And you need people kind of lead you slightly by the hand and say, actually, if you go over there's something else that's interesting.
Right.
And I would say the first person for me to do that was reading and listening to Paul Weller and his lists of his influences and everything else, because it led you all over the place.
Yeah.
And it leads you down really worrying and very, very expensive pathways.
Such as?
Oh, becoming a Blue Note completist, for instance.
Oh, but God, that cost.
Oh, my Lord.
How far did you get down that particular primrose path?
Not far enough and enormously expensive enough.
By God, that's an undertaking, that is.
Well, it was, but of course now you just press a button and it's all there.
Yeah, it's all there. It's no fun anymore.
Yeah, but you can't have the sleeves scattered around your house casually to impress people. Did
you follow Paul Weller's advice at any point and think, Paul, I don't agree with you here. You're wrong in this case. Did you ever do that?
Well yes. I think that is the answer, because we all have artists that, however much we listen to, however much we're told they're brilliant, you can't live with. And you were talking about that last week, I think, David, with, I can't remember who it was, but you
Forever Changes by Love.
Forever Changes, the album he tries to like every year.
Yeah. So the two that I can't do are Radiohead, and I try and I try and I try.
Yep.
And this is heresy for most people. Van Morrison, can't get on with it. Can't get on with Van Morrison at all.
Okay, I'm going to ask you...
Well, early Van Morrison's very different from late Van Morrison.
Well, I'm going to ask a supplementary on Van Morrison. At what point did you enter Van Morrison world? I mean, which records did you try?
Well, you start with, what is the...
Well, the classics are always Astral Weeks and Moon Dance.
So you start with Astral Weeks. That's okay. And then I kind of got a bit excited, but not enough excited about there's one about churches and cathedrals, isn't there?
St. Dominic's preview.
Yeah.
Dominic's preview, that's the one. And then from there, it all just...
Right. Well, listen. I'm here with good news. Just relax, for goodness sake. It's not a duty to like music. It's the worst thing in the world to try and like music. And I do my thing every year with Love's Forever Changes. Not because I'm really trying. I just think one day it might, just... Because music just does happen to you at certain different points in your life with different reactions. But I certainly don't strain to like it. And there's nothing more, ruinous to musical appreciation than straining to like something, I think. And and you're not alone with Radiohead. Radiohead, I have glimmers when I like them, and then they leave me cold.
I love Radiohead, but they are cold. They're a cold concept. There's no warmth coming off them. Danny Baker tweets all the time. I think he did last night that he always tries once a year with the Grateful Dead. And he takes it really seriously. He sits down with the cans on.
That's a lot of work.
Big glass of red. Yeah. And he says he really tries. But it's making that effort that probably produces a subconscious resistance.
Particularly the Grateful Dead. You shouldn't. No,
you either
strain you. It's either going to steal up upon you or it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
And I obviously grew up in an earlier generation. So, the Beatles were constantly talking about stuff that they'd heard, and it would very often be American R&B or whatever, And I don't remember. Do you remember? Was it John Lennon or the Beatles all together who talked about Harry Nilsson when Harry Nilsson arrived? And just overnight, they made Harry Nilsson a huge star because they'd heard him via Derek Taylor or something like that, I think it was. So they were very definite kind of evangelists for whatever they'd heard. They'd just come back from America. Oh, we've been listening to this. And therefore you'd have to go and seek it out. What about you, Mark?
Well, I remember the times that I was up in London, I used to listen to the Charlie Gillett's Radio London show.
Yeah.
And that was good. And I think that's where I first heard Ian Dury. I think I first heard Graham Parker and Costello. And John Peel, I heard all sorts of things. John Fay, I can remember hearing him play John Fay, and The Only Ones, and the Buzzcocks. And then various people, Nick Kent talking about television, and Charles Sharma, Alan Jones and the Melody Maker, talk about pub rock. But then I was really lucky. I mean, later on I was working in magazines, and I was working with people like Dave and Neil Tennant and Paul Du Noyer and all that. And they're just, that whole idea of coming into an office with a mixtape, that was the most educational thing. You had like a mini radio station in the office. I can remember Jim Irvin. Jim Irvin. And also people really showing off, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Obscure corners of the record. They go, oh, don't you know this? And I can remember Jim Irvin coming in on the second day, I think he was at Mojo, and he brought in a tape. It started with Baltimore by Nina Simone. Right. And I'd never really heard any Nina Simone, and I found it was absolutely riveted by it. I went back and listened to everything she had. So we were very lucky. Yeah, we had only little DJs on tap, didn't we, Dave?
But we also were very lucky because the extension of that is that you wrote that stuff down. And we bought the magazine and we read the lists and we then thought, oh, that sounds interesting.
Well, that's true. That's partly why we did it, actually, is that we'd have a little what's playing in the office. You're absolutely right.
It's a fact of life, and it's gone now with the world of magazines, with few rare exceptions, that the stuff you put the least work into is always the things most valued by the readers. And so it's very often, do a list. Just do a list down in the corner.
Just bang it out.
Bang it out.
Because we're busy chiseling away at this thing. We've been up all night. We think it's brilliant. Partly because it took so much time. But the readers don't know that. They don't care.
And particularly, nowadays when everything is available, everybody's got the same record collection. So all you need to have is the nudge to go and listen to this thing, Because that I find is the real frustration about the situation we're in now, that I always feel we've got unlimited supply of everything out there, and we've got a tiny window through which we can access it, which is iTunes or Spotify or whatever you use, and it has its own navigational devices, which I just switched on Spotify. And I did it this afternoon a couple of hours ago, and I hadn't used it for a little while. And suddenly, absolutely everything on my front page on Spotify is jazz. Because clearly the last time I used Spotify was to play it at a jazz. And that's great, but it very quickly assumes that's who you are. You don't like anything else, So, good though those devices are, there's nothing that beats the kind of the human element,
The left field human suggestion.
It's the left field. It's the suggestion. I tell you what I always take notice of, and I took a notice of this. We did a thing. Will Hodgkins, who's the rights man music for the Times, and he did his list of albums of the year, whatever it was, at the end of last year. And no disrespect at all, but there's a lot of stuff that rock critics are going to mention. If there's a Radiohead album, it'll be there. Da-da-da-da-da-da. And then at the bottom of it was Ornette Coleman. Was it Ornette Coleman? Yeah, Ornette Coleman and Floating Points. This collaboration between free jazz and this kind of trance musician. And I thought, that sounds interesting. Because he hasn't put that in there to win any points. You know what I mean? He just put it there because he genuinely likes it. So I went and bought it. And it's really good,
Know what happens in half an hour's time? I fire up I use Tidal, but and that's what I'll go and listen to.
Well, there you go. There you go. That's how it works.
Because I don't know about it until somebody tells me about it.
Absolutely. Well, go and try it, and I hope you enjoy it. And if you don't blame me.
Yeah, exactly.
So listen, well, it's been nice to talk to you, Steve, on the occasion of your birthday, and thank you for your support.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.